Stop. Before you do anything else right now, before you scroll, before you skip ahead to the next thing waiting for your attention, I need you to hear this. God is saying no. Not to you, not about your worth or your calling or your future. God is saying no to what is about to happen to you if you miss what this message is carrying. And the reason this is marked as an emergency is not for the algorithm. It is because what is on the other side of the next few minutes is either the thing that changes your trajectory or the thing you will spend years wishing you had paid closer attention to in the moment it was available. So here is where we begin. God has set something up, a specific arrangement placed specifically for you at this specific point in your story, not in general, specifically. There is a sequence of events, a convergence of timing, people, and resources that God has been engineering for longer than you realize, and the enemy knows about it. The enemy has been watching the sequence develop, and the enemy has installed exactly one trap directly inside the setup, one specific mechanism designed to make the person for whom the setup was arranged either dismiss the whole thing as ordinary or walk away from it as dangerous. And the tragedy is not that most chosen ones get taken out by something dramatic and obvious. The tragedy is that most chosen ones get taken out by something quiet, by a reaction pattern so familiar they do not even register it as a decision when it happens. I want to be precise about what a divine setup actually is, because the word is used loosely, and I am not using it loosely here. When God engineers a setup, the setup is not a test of your worthiness. It is not a trap that God is watching to see whether you fall into. It is not a challenge placed in your way to refine your character, though character refinement may happen as a byproduct. A divine setup is a specific alignment of circumstances, timing, people, and resources that God has arranged to move a chosen one from one level of their assignment to the next. It is a transition mechanism. It is the kind of moment that, when chosen ones look back from the other side of it, they describe as the thing that changed everything, the pivot point, the clear line between who they were before and who they became after. Divine setups are not always dramatic. Some of them look completely ordinary from the outside. Some of them are a conversation, a decision, a message that arrives in an ordinary format at an ordinary time. The extraordinary nature of the setup is not always visible in the packaging. It is visible in the consequences, in the trajectory change that follows the choice to engage fully with what God placed there versus the flatness that follows the choice to scroll past. And here is what makes divine setups so significant in the larger story. A chosen one who crosses through a divine setup does not just advance their own calling. They carry an authority into their next season that they could not have accessed without the specific passage. The enemy understands this. The enemy does not just want to delay you. The enemy wants to prevent you from acquiring what only comes from crossing through the specific thing God arranged, which is why the trap is not placed around the setup. It is placed inside it, where you will not see it as a trap because you are already inside the thing God is doing. I am going to describe 5 specific forms this trap takes inside a divine setup, and I need you to listen for the one you recognize. Not the most dramatic one, not the most extreme version, the one you have actually encountered, the one you have actually used, even when you thought you were being wise or careful or discerning, because the enemy does not craft one-size-fits-all traps. The enemy studies the specific person, the specific history, the specific wound that is most adjacent to what God is currently arranging. And the trap is built from material you already know and, in other contexts, have every reason to trust. The first form is the familiarity dismissal. This is when a divine setup arrives in completely ordinary packaging. No thunder, no supernatural confirmation, no feeling of profound significance to mark the moment. It looks like an opportunity that does not feel remarkable, a door that opens quietly without the weight you expected, a God-arranged door to carry. And the trap is the thought pattern that says, if this were truly from God, I would feel something more significant than what I am feeling right now. So the chosen one passes through without fully engaging. They are present in body but absent in depth. The surface level of the encounter is engaged while the deeper invitation goes unrecognized, and the setup moves through, without the chosen one ever understanding what was available inside it. The second form is the wound redirect. This is the most surgically precise of the 5. The enemy locates the specific previous wound that is most adjacent to what God is trying to do now. Not a distant wound, the recent one, the one that still has a live edge on it. The last time something looked like this, the last time you followed something that presented itself as a calling, it placed you in a situation that felt harmful. So when God arranges the present setup, the enemy does not argue against it theologically. The enemy does not suggest that you are unworthy or that God does not love you. The enemy simply redirects your attention to the evidence from the last time, and the chosen one acts from what feels like wisdom. The protection reflex is real. The wound that activated it is real. The enemy simply pointed at it from exactly the right angle and at exactly the right moment. The third form is the urgency inversion. This is when God is doing something in sequence, and the enemy collapses the timeline artificially. God builds a setup in layers. There is a sequence to the arrangement. There is a process of preparation that the setup requires in order to produce what it is designed to produce. And the enemy inserts into that process a manufactured urgency that says, if this were truly from God, it should be moving faster than this. So the chosen one either abandons what God arranged because it appears to have stalled, or they begin to force the timing in ways that actually break the sequence that made the setup possible. They act from urgency rather than from the pace the setup requires, and the arrangement which needed the chosen one to hold steady and move at a specific tempo cannot survive the forcing. The fourth form is the counterfeit resolution. This is the most sophisticated of the five, and the one most likely to be confused with a blessing. Before the divine setup fully arrives, before the sequence completes, the enemy provides a version of what the setup was meant to produce. Not a bad version necessarily, a good enough version, a relationship that looks right, a platform that creates visibility before the depth and rootedness that visibility requires, a financial opening that creates dependency instead of freedom, because the character development the setup was meant to produce had not yet happened. The chosen one receives what looks like resolution, and the pressure and hunger that was supposed to sustain them through the full process of the setup is released prematurely, and when the actual setup arrives, they are not in the condition required to enter it. The counterfeit did not destroy them. It just made the real thing unnecessary in the moment it arrived. The fifth form is the legitimacy challenge. The setup arrives, and the enemy immediately supplies a theological or logical argument against it. Who told you this was specifically from God? What evidence do you have that this is not simply a coincidence or a product of wishful thinking? Do you know how many people have believed God was doing something specific and have been wrong, sometimes catastrophically wrong? This form is particularly effective against chosen ones who have a developed intellectual and spiritual life, who value genuine discernment, who have watched others go off track by claiming divine direction for decisions that were ultimately self-serving. The enemy weaponizes the very discernment that was developed through faithfulness. The challenge is not irrational. It sounds responsible. It arrives at the precise moment designed to prevent entry into what God arranged, and the chosen one walks away feeling responsible and careful rather than feeling deceived. Now, I want to ask you something directly. Which of these five did you recognize? Not the one that sounded most interesting theologically, the one your chest responded to, the one that matched a specific season you have been through or a specific moment you are in right now. Because the reason God said no, no, no is not that the setup is too dangerous for you to enter. It is that the enemy has placed one of these five traps inside the setup, and without seeing it clearly, the most sincere and capable chosen ones walk into the trap from inside the very thing God arranged for their advancement. Today we are going to do something different. We are going to see it clearly before the moment of decision arrives. I want to go deeper into why the trap works, not just the five forms which we named in the first part of this message, but the mechanics underneath them. Because if you only know what the trap looks like, that helps. But if you understand why it works, you can recognize it in real time while you are inside the setup before the moment of decision has passed. The trap works because of a specific dynamic that shows up in every major divine setup recorded in Scripture. And I have studied enough of these stories in enough depth that I can tell you the pattern is not accidental. It is not coincidental that the same mechanism appears in the story of Joseph, and in the story of Ruth, and in the story of Daniel, and in the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. The mechanism is the same because the enemy understood the mechanism before any human being did. And the mechanism is this. Every divine setup requires a moment of active, non-defended receptivity in order to produce what it was designed to produce. And that specific state, non-defended receptivity, is precisely what the trap is designed to prevent. I want to use a specific story to illustrate this because the abstract explanation is not enough. This is the story of Elisha and the servant at Dothan. Most people who know this story focus on the army of horses and chariots of fire that God revealed to the servant when Elisha prayed for his eyes to be opened. The supernatural element is compelling, and it is the part that gets repeated. But the thing that most people pass over is what was happening before Elisha prayed. The servant was already present, already awake, already looking at the same situation Elisha was looking at. The information was available to both of them at the same time. Same eyes, same morning, same location, same visible threat surrounding the city. The difference was not information. The difference was receptivity. Elisha was in a state that allowed him to see what was actually present. The servant was in a state of fear, contracted perception, which narrowed his field to the visible threat and blocked access to the larger reality that was also present in the same space. God did not create a new reality for the servant when Elisha prayed. God opened access for the servant to a reality that was already there. The setup had been in place the entire time. The servant simply was not in the condition required to receive it. I want you to sit with that for a moment before we move on. The setup was not created when Elisha prayed. The chariots were already there. The angelic presence was already in position. The provision that the servant needed in order to not be destroyed by fear was present in the same location where the fear was operating. The prayer did not produce the resource. The prayer opened the receiver, and the moment the receiver opened, the resource that had been present and inaccessible became present and available. This is the model for what happens inside a divine setup. The arrangement is not waiting for your worthiness to activate it. It is waiting for your receptivity to receive it. This is the dynamic inside every divine setup. The arrangement is in place. The resources, the timing, the people, the provision are present in the same space where you are present. The difference between the chosen one who crosses through the setup and the one who passes through without ever understanding what was available is not the presence or absence of the arrangement. It is the presence or absence of the interior condition required to receive what the arrangement contains. And now I want to name something that most of this conversation avoids because it feels uncomfortable to say directly. The reason most chosen ones are not in that interior condition when the divine setup arrives is not a spiritual failure. It is not a lack of faith or a character defect or evidence that they are not truly chosen. It is a specific neurological reality about how the brain processes information under sustained pressure and stress, and how that processing mode affects the capacity for exactly the kind of non-defended receptivity that a divine setup requires. We are going to come back to this in a few parts. For now, I want you to hold it as a question. Why, despite your sincerity and your genuine desire to receive what God has for you, does the reception often feel partial? Why does the clear knowing come and go? Why does the moment of deep certainty arrive and then fade before you have fully acted from it? There is something specific that happens in the brain of a person who has been carrying sustained pressure for a long time. Something measurable, something that the Nobel Prize research we will discuss later in this message addresses directly. For now, the thing I want to name is this: the experience of knowing something deeply and then losing access to that knowing within minutes or hours. The experience of being certain in one moment and uncertain in the next. The experience of the signal arriving clearly and then becoming static is not a spiritual symptom. It is a neurological one, and neurological symptoms have neurological solutions. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Rachel. Not her actual name, but her story is real. And it is the story I receive in more variations than almost any other from people who engage with this content deeply. Rachel had been in a specific season of preparation for years, not passive preparation, active, committed, costly preparation. She had said yes to every invitation to grow that had arrived in that season. She had done the inner work. She had built the disciplines. She had cleared the debts and the relationships and the mental patterns that she knew were blocking her. By every metric she was aware of, she was ready. And then the divine setup arrived. It did not look the way she had imagined it. It arrived as a specific invitation to step into a space that was adjacent to her calling, but not exactly her calling as she had been holding it. It arrived with an unusual messenger, someone she would not have expected God to use based on her existing understanding of how God had been working in her life. It arrived quietly, without confirmation from the people she had been asking for confirmation. And Rachel, who was sincere and prepared and genuinely chosen, did 2 of the 5 things we named in the first part of this message. She applied the familiarity dismissal because the packaging was unfamiliar, and then she applied the legitimacy challenge because she could not get confirmation from the sources she had been consulting. The setup passed, not gone permanently. God does not abandon setups, but the sequence that was arranged moved into a different configuration. The specific convergence of timing and people and resources that was present in that window was no longer present in the same way 6 months later. And what Rachel described when she finally understood what had been available was not regret in the dramatic sense. It was a quiet, specific grief for the particular version of the thing that had been arranged for that moment that was no longer available in that exact form. She also described something that I want to name directly because I have heard it in enough variations to know it is not unique to her. She said that in the weeks after the setup passed, she returned to the memory of the invitation repeatedly, not to analyze it, but because something in her kept reaching back toward the quality of what had been present in that first moment of contact, that initial flash of knowing before the analysis began. It was as if the deeper part of her understood what the analytical part had dismissed and was not willing to fully accept that dismissal as final. That reaching back is significant. It is the signal trying to be heard after the moment for acting on it has passed. It is the receiver trying to stay open past the point where the transmission was available. She told me she knew in the first 10 minutes that something was significant about the invitation. There was a knowing that was present below the level of her analytical evaluation, but she had no reliable way to hold on to that knowing while the analysis was running. By the time she had completed the discernment process she had learned to run, the knowing had faded and the analysis had produced the result it tends to produce when it runs without the counterweight of deep receptivity. It said, "Not enough evidence." Wait, let me say something about that specific experience. The knowing that arrives in the first moments of a divine setup and then fades during analysis is not random. It is not the unreliable intuition that wisdom traditions warn against. It is the most accurate signal available in the moment it arrives. What makes it fade is not the quality of the signal. It is the specific neurological condition of the receiver. When the brain is operating in the partial capacity that sustained pressure and stress produces over time, the capacity to hold open awareness, to sustain a signal without immediately resolving it into the categories of the analytical mind, is dramatically reduced. The signal arrives, the analytical system immediately begins processing it, and in the processing, the depth of the signal is lost, while the surface information remains. You remember that something felt significant. You cannot access what the significance was pointing toward, and the setup that required you to move from the depth of the knowing passes while you are working with the memory of it. So now we have named the problem with the precision it requires. We have named the 5 forms the trap takes. We have named the dynamic of non-defended receptivity, and why it is both necessary for a divine setup to deliver what it contains, and precisely what the trap is designed to prevent. We have looked at the story of Elisha and the servant at Dothan. We have followed Rachel through the setup that passed, and the specific grief of understanding in retrospect what was available. And now I want to give you something that changes the experience from this moment forward, not eventually, starting in the next few minutes of this message. There are 3 specific practices that build what I am going to call setup literacy, the ability to recognize a divine setup while you are inside it rather than only in hindsight. These are not abstract spiritual principles. They are practical, specific, repeatable actions that address each of the 3 primary failure modes we have identified. I am going to describe each one carefully, and then we are going to do one of them together in this message before we close. The first practice is the stillness interrupt. This addresses the familiarity dismissal and the legitimacy challenge, the first and 5th forms of the trap. When something arrives that may be a setup, before you evaluate it, before you run the discernment process, before you consult anyone, before you do anything with the content of the invitation, you take 30 seconds of complete stillness, not to listen for a voice, not to feel a feeling, simply to stop the analytical processing that begins automatically the moment something enters your awareness. Here is why this matters at the neurological level. The analytical mind processes at a specific speed and tends to reach resolution quickly. The deeper receptive capacity of the right hemisphere processes more slowly and requires the analytical system to pause in order to contribute its reading of the situation. 30 seconds of stillness after an invitation arrives is not a spiritual technique. It is giving the full brain a moment to register what is present before the faster analytical system files it under familiar categories and moves on. Most chosen ones have never tried this because it feels too simple. The setups that have passed by them while they were in the middle of their discernment process were not resolved by a more sophisticated process. They were resolved by 30 seconds. They did not give themselves. There is a specific quality that the deeper receptive process carries that the analytical system does not produce, and that quality is available in the stillness that follows the arrival of an invitation before the analysis takes over. Some people describe it as a warmth. Some describe it as a weight in the chest that is not uncomfortable. Some describe it simply as knowing without knowing why they know. Whatever the description, it is the reading that the full brain produces when both hemispheres are given a moment to register what arrived together before the left hemisphere begins. The processing sequence that tends to narrow the field down to what is already known and categorized. The second practice is the signal journal. This addresses the wound redirect and the counterfeit resolution, the second and fourth forms of the trap. The signal journal is a simple practice. Anytime you have an experience of the knowing I described in the previous part of this message, the flash of recognition that arrives before the analysis starts, you write it down. Not the analysis, not your evaluation of whether the signal is trustworthy, the raw signal, what it felt like. The reason this practice changes the dynamic is that it creates an archive that the analytical mind cannot revise. The wound redirect works partly because the analytical mind reframes the signal after the fact. It says, "That was not a genuine knowing. That was wishful thinking." The signal journal holds the pre-analysis record, and over time, as you review it, you begin to see a pattern in your own signals that your analytical mind cannot dismiss, because you wrote it down in the moment before the analysis had reached its conclusion. You begin to trust your own signal, because you have a record that is more accurate than the revised memory the analytical mind would prefer to work from. Many chosen ones have spent years in a condition where they do not trust their own knowing, not because the knowing is unreliable, but because it has been overridden so many times by the analytical revision process that the signal itself has become less distinct, less confident, more hesitant to make itself known, because the previous times it made itself known, it was immediately subjected to a process that concluded it was not enough. The signal journal reverses this dynamic. It is not a spiritual diary, it is an evidence base. And evidence built over weeks and months changes the relationship between the chosen one and their own interior signal in a way that instruction alone does not produce. The third practice is the setup assumption. This addresses the urgency inversion, the third form of the trap, and it is the most counterintuitive of the three. The setup assumption means that you begin operating from the working hypothesis that God is arranging something specific in the present season of your life, regardless of whether you can see it clearly yet. Not as a formula, not as a belief you are trying to manufacture, but as a practical posture that changes what you pay attention to. When you are operating from the setup assumption, you are looking for what the sequence requires rather than looking for evidence that the sequence is real. You are asking different questions. Instead of, "Is this from God?" you are asking, "What does God seem to be building here? And what does this moment in the sequence require from me?" The shift in question changes what is available to you in the moment. It moves you from a defensive evaluation posture to a collaborative building posture. And in that posture, the urgency inversion has less traction, because you are not measuring the speed of the process against an external standard. You are participating in the process and asking what the process needs. This posture change is not passive. It is actually more active than the evaluating posture, because it requires you to pay attention to the sequence, rather than only to the individual moments within it. What happened this week that connects to what happened 3 weeks ago? What invitation arrived today that might be the next step in something God has been constructing? What door that seemed to close was actually a redirect rather than a refusal? The setup assumption does not create setups that were not there. It makes visible the setup that was already in progress and that the evaluating posture was filtering out as ordinary. Now I want to do something practical. I am going to give you a brief exercise to do right now, in this moment, while you are engaged with this message. This is the stillness interrupt applied to what is happening in you as you listen to this content. Here is the instruction. Pause. Take 30 seconds. Do not evaluate whether this message is from God or is applicable to your situation or is relevant to where you are. Simply notice what is present in your body right now that arrived while you were listening. Where is there weight? Where is there a warmth or a response that precedes the analysis of whether the response is reliable? Where is there something that has been quietly active underneath the thinking that you have not named yet? The thing you just noticed, whatever it was, that is not a feeling. That is a signal. And the practice we are building is the practice of holding it rather than immediately resolving it, letting it stay present long enough to give you information that the analytical process alone cannot access. The setup God has arranged does not require your emotional certainty. It requires your receptivity. And receptivity is a skill, one that can be learned, one that, as we are going to discuss later in this message, has a specific neurological foundation that can be restored regardless of how long the pressure of your particular life circumstances has been eroding it. Comment your signal right now. Type what you noticed in that 30 seconds, not an analysis, the raw signal, what was present before you decided what to do with it. This community is a place where those signals are honored rather than evaluated. And something happens when a chosen one names their signal in a space where others are doing the same. The isolation of the almost cycle begins to break. The knowing becomes more available rather than less. The setup that is in motion in your life right now has more traction when the person it was arranged for is in a community of people who are also learning to stay open to what God has arranged. Before we move into the final sections of this message, I want to name something that applies to everything we have covered today. Every practice I have just described assumes a baseline level of receptivity that allows the practice to work. If the neurological disconnection that sustained pressure produces over time has reduced that baseline significantly, the practices help, but they cannot fully address the root. The technique is correct. The environment is insufficient. In the next part of this message, we are going to look at what restores the environment, what rebuilds the neurological foundation that allows these practices to produce their full effect, and why the solution is simpler and more available than most people in this situation have been led to believe. Let me tell you what the research actually says about what happens to the brain of a person who has been carrying sustained pressure, high responsibility, and unresolved purpose tension across an extended period of time. Because the description I am about to give you is going to match your lived experience more precisely than most explanations you have been offered for why the pattern of reaching the edge and not crossing it has persisted despite your effort and your sincerity and your genuine commitment to changing it. In 1981, Dr. Roger Sperry received the Nobel Prize for his research on what the neuroscience community calls split brain function. What Dr. Sperry proved through years of rigorous clinical research is that the two hemispheres of the brain are designed to operate in a state of active synchronization. When that synchronization is intact, the full processing capacity of the human mind is available. The depth and receptivity of the right hemisphere and the analytical precision of the left hemisphere are working together simultaneously, each contributing to the same experience rather than operating in alternation or competition. In this state, the capacity to hold something open, to receive a signal without immediately resolving it, to recognize the quality of a divine setup rather than just the surface content of the invitation, is natural and consistent. It does not require effort. It is the default operation of the synchronized brain. When the synchronization is disrupted, which happens gradually through the accumulation of sustained pressure and survival mode operation, the left hemisphere becomes dominant and the right hemisphere goes partially quiet. The person does not lose their intellectual capacity. They do not lose their faith or their desire or their commitment. What they lose is the seamless collaboration between the two processing modes that produces whole brain awareness. The analytical system remains highly functional. What diminishes is precisely the receptive capacity that makes setup literacy possible. The capacity to hold the signal before resolving it. The capacity to know something at a level that precedes and exceeds the analysis. The capacity that was described in the Elisha story as the condition required to see what is already present. This is not a metaphor or a spiritual interpretation of the data. This is what the neurological data shows about what sustained pressure does to the synchronized operation of the brain over time. And this is why the three practices described in Part 3, while valuable and effective, produce better results when the neurological foundation they require is restored to its designed level of function. The practices are the swimming technique. Whole brain synchronization is the full pool. Here is the number that most people find difficult to accept and then find impossible to forget once they have heard it. 98% of children measure at genius level creative capacity because the whole brain synchronization is intact by default in childhood. The synchronization is natural, uncontested, operating at design capacity. By adulthood, according to the same research, fewer than 1 in 1,000 people maintain that level of synchronization. The rest are operating on partial capacity, not because they made a choice that reduced it, but because the conditions of modern life, the sustained stress and performance pressure and information overload and chronic stimulation, gradually eroded the synchronization that was never meant to be conditional on anything. Think about what that number means for the specific experience of a chosen one. The person who was wired at birth with the kind of assignment that requires the full brain to recognize and receive and act on what God has arranged, operating across years, potentially decades, at a fraction of the neurological capacity that the assignment requires. The gap between the clarity of the calling and the ability to consistently access the depth of knowing that the calling requires to be fully lived from is not a spiritual gap. It is a measurable neurological gap between the synchronization level the brain was designed to maintain and the level it is currently operating at. A woman from California described what it felt like. She had tried everything: prayer, journaling, meditation, every practice her community offered, and she kept arriving at the same experience. She believed the words. She could not feel the reality behind them, not in her body, not in the lived texture of her days. After 10 days of something different, she said something cleared. A channel that had been blocked was suddenly open, not because she tried harder, because the receiver had been repaired. A man from Texas described something similar, someone who had spent years holding things together for everyone around him, while his own interior life became thin and distant. He said prayer had started to feel like the frequency was right, but the receiver was off. 2 weeks later, he woke up and described his mind as running on all of what it was supposed to run on. The fog that had been so consistent, he had stopped registering it as fog, was gone. That is because of what the team I am about to describe discovered. A team of neuroscientists, led by Dr. Daniel Barron in New York, spent years addressing exactly this gap. They took over an hour of clinical neural sync technology, the kind of whole brain activation protocol used in specialized medical contexts to restore hemisphere synchronization in clinical populations, and through an intensive compression and refinement process, they distilled it into an 8-minute targeted auditory sequence. 8 minutes a day, headphones, eyes closed. That is the complete physical requirement. They call it the genius switch, and the name is precise, not because it makes you smart in the way an intelligence test measures, but because it switches on the whole brain operation that was the genius level default of your childhood. The state in which the stillness interrupt produces what it is designed to produce. The state in which the signal journal begins building an accurate record faster than it does in a partially synchronized brain. The state in which the setup assumption is not an act of faith you are trying to maintain, but a natural orientation because the full brain is registering what the partial brain filters out. They call it the genius switch. If you have tried other sound-based or frequency-based tools before and not experienced the shift you were looking for, Dr. Barron addresses this precisely and clearly on the page where he makes this available. Brainwave products target a narrow dimension of neural activity. Sound frequencies address auditory processing without addressing hemisphere synchronization at the whole brain level. What the genius switch does is qualitatively different because the mechanism is different. It was built specifically to address what Dr. Sperry identified as the root of reduced whole brain capacity, which is hemisphere disconnection. Not any single frequency or state associated with that disconnection. The genius switch is not for everyone. It is for the chosen one who understands that God prepared not only the promise, but the mind that must walk into it. The person who has been sincere for years, who has done the work, who has felt the call clearly and kept returning to it even when the evidence was not cooperating, and who is willing to stop treating the fog as a character flaw and start treating it as something that has a specific address. Most people who hear about this will scroll past. They have accepted the reduced version of their mind as permanent. You are still here. That is not coincidence. That is the specific kind of persistence that belongs to the person this was built for. One thing worth naming directly, if you search YouTube or Spotify for anything that sounds like this, most had no neural sync technology embedded at all. They carried the name because the barrier to labeling something that way is essentially zero. The mechanism is what makes the difference, and the mechanism only exists in what his team built. Here is the access structure. In-person neurofeedback with a qualified practitioner who uses hemisphere synchronization protocols costs approximately $300 per session. Clinical-grade home neurofeedback hardware runs between $5,000 and $7,000 before software or ongoing support. Dr. Barron and his team built this specifically for the person who does not have those resources and who cannot afford another barrier between where they are and the neurological foundation their calling requires. Colleagues in the neuroscience field described what was built here as extraordinary value, even at $500. Not $500, not $200, not $100. The standard release price is $49. The guarantee is unconditional, not time-limited. You can use the 8-minute sequence once. You can use it every day for months. If you do not experience the shift in receptivity and depth of awareness that the 18,000 people who have used this have described, you contact them and every dollar is returned. No conditions, no questions asked. 4 bonuses are included: a guided visualization from one of the top teachers on the Calm platform, a grocery guide identifying the specific foods widely available in the American market that neurological research links to active suppression of whole brain function, with straightforward substitutions that typically reduce monthly grocery costs by $80 to $120. A foundational text over 100 years old that forms the source material for most contemporary practices around the mechanics of receiving and recognition, and a daily habits guide specifically designed to support the neurological conditions that allow whole brain synchronization to sustain itself across the full day rather than only during dedicated practice time. I want to say this specifically to the person who has been working through the content of this message and recognizing themselves in it. The 5 trap forms, the story of the setup that passed, the practices if those descriptions were not theoretical to you, if they match something you have lived or are currently living, then what Dr. Barron built is not a supplement to the work you are doing. It is the restoration of the capacity that the work requires. Type "I see the setup" in the comments right now because you do, and naming what you see changes the relationship between the seeing and the acting. The tool does not replace God. The tool does not replace obedience. It does not surrender for you. It does not close the door for you. What God is doing in you is not conditional on any tool, but a tool that restores the receiver, gives what God is doing more of what it was designed to land in. One more thing before we move into the closing of this message. The divine setup God has arranged for you is not a single moment that you either catch or miss permanently. God does not arrange something for a chosen one and then withdraw it after one window, but every window of a setup does have a specific configuration. The timing, the people, the exact convergence of resources and readiness that make a particular version of the passage possible. Those are not infinitely patient. The setup God is holding open for you right now has a specific quality to it that is present in this season and that will look different in the next season. What was described earlier restores the capacity to recognize that quality, to hold it without losing it to the analysis, and to move from it before the configuration shifts. That is what the 18,000 people who used it describe. Not that their lives became easier, but that they became able to receive what was always being offered. We are near the end of this message, and I want to be present in this closing with everything I have brought to the rest of it, because there is something I need you to understand about the moment you are in right now, having received what this message contained. You came into this video at a specific point in your story. Whether that point is the middle of a season of preparation, the edge of something you have been reaching toward, or a place of quiet exhaustion from years of sincere effort that have not yet produced the passage you have been working toward, you came in carrying a specific weight. And this message was not designed to add to that weight. It was designed to give you the precise information that changes what the weight means. Not that the work was wrong, not that you were wrong, but that the instrument was operating below capacity, that the setup is real, that the trap is identifiable, and that the capacity required to navigate the trap and cross through the setup is restorable. That is not a general encouragement. That is a specific technical claim supported by decades of Nobel Prize research, by the work of Dr. Daniel Barron and his team in New York, and by the documented experience of 18,000 people who were in a version of the same place you are in before they made the specific choice this message is building toward. The capacity is restorable, not eventually, not after a long process of additional preparation, but with 8 minutes a day, starting today. Here is what I believe is true about you based on the fact that you stayed for this full message, not generically, specifically. You have been operating with a level of commitment that most people you know cannot access. You have been sincerely following something that has cost you things, and you have kept following despite the cost. You have had moments of profound clarity that you could not fully sustain, and that have haunted you a little in the way that a signal you could not hold on to haunts the person who knows the signal was real. Those moments of clarity were not failures of your faith, or your receptivity, or your character. They were the full brain, briefly synchronized, giving you a reading of what is actually arranged for you. The fact that you could not hold them was not a spiritual deficiency. It was the neurological reality of a brain that has been running on partial synchronization for longer than you may realize. The clarity was never the problem, the duration was. What changes when the synchronization is restored is not what you are shown. It is how long you can hold what you are shown before the analytical system files it under familiar categories and moves on. This is the moment in this message where I want to be specific rather than inspirational. The experience of receiving clarity, losing the clarity, and having the pattern repeat is not addressed by more spiritual content. It is addressed by restoring the neurological foundation that allows the clarity to be sustained. That is a different kind of solution than most chosen ones have been offered. It does not ask you to try harder, or go deeper, or find a more effective practice. It addresses the mechanism. Fix the mechanism, and the practices you already have access to become dramatically more effective. The signal becomes clearer and stays clearer. The knowing becomes accessible rather than intermittent. The trap that has been working in the gap between the signal and the action loses the gap it has been working in. Now I want to do something in this space that I do not always do in the closing of a message. I want to name the setup God has arranged for you in this season in the most concrete terms I can access from this side of the screen. You have been in preparation. The preparation has been longer and more costly than you anticipated it would be. And there is something in you that has been asking in the quieter moments whether the preparation is moving towards something, or whether you have simply been in a long holding pattern that will continue indefinitely. The answer to that question is the answer this message was designed to deliver. The preparation is moving towards something. God does not prepare people indefinitely without bringing them to the passage the preparation was building toward. The setup is real. The window is present. What this message did was give you the vocabulary to recognize it and the neurological context to understand why you have been standing at the edge rather than crossing through. Take 30 seconds right now, no instruction beyond that. 30 seconds of stillness before the closing declaration. Let what this message contains settle from your mind into the part of you that processes at the level the setup requires. The part that does not need to decide whether this is trustworthy before receiving it. The part that recognized itself in the first 3 minutes of this message and has been receiving confirmation of what it already knew for the rest of it. What you just felt in those 30 seconds, that is the signal. That is the knowing that was always present and has been interrupted by the neurological disconnection that the work we describe today is designed to address. That knowing has not been wrong about you. It has been right about you the entire time. What changes now is that you are taking the specific step that restores the capacity to hold it consistently enough to act from it with the confidence it deserves. The quality of what you felt in those 30 seconds is the quality that has been available to you in flashes throughout the seasons of preparation. The quality that the setup God has arranged was always going to require you to be able to sustain. What was described does not produce that quality. You already have access to it. What it does is remove the neurological barrier that keeps it intermittent. The chosen one who completes 30 days with 8 minutes a day describes the experience not as receiving something new, but as being able to hold what was always there. The signal that used to arrive for 10 seconds now stays for 10 minutes. And in those 10 minutes, the action the signal is pointing toward becomes possible in a way it was not when the signal lasted only 10 seconds. I want to close this message with something I mean in the most direct and non-abstract way possible. God said, no, that was not a rejection. That was the most specific and protective declaration possible in this moment of your story. No to the trap that was installed inside the setup. No to the familiarity dismissal. No to the wound redirect. No to the urgency inversion. No to the counterfeit resolution. No to the legitimacy challenge. No to every mechanism the enemy has been using to keep you circling the edge of what God arranged without entering it. The no was protective because the yes is real. The setup is real. The arrangement God has been building in your story is real, and it is in motion, and it is not dependent on your achieving a state of perfect certainty before you engage with it. It is dependent on your receptivity, and your receptivity is being restored. Say this out loud right now if you can. I see the setup. I release the trap. I cross through. Say it with the weight it deserves, not as a formula, but as a declaration from someone who now has the vocabulary to name what has been happening and the neurological context to understand why crossing through is possible, now, in a way it may not have been in previous seasons. The brain has been given what it needs. The instrument is being retuned. The window is open. God does not prepare and then abandon. God does not arrange and then withdraw at the moment the arrangement is most needed. You have been given today the tools to recognize the configuration, the signal clarity to see the difference between the divine arrangement and the counterfeit installed inside it, the neurological foundation to hold the signal long enough to act from it before the analytical system overrides the knowing. And there is something I want to say directly to the person who is reading this and thinking, this sounds right, but I am not sure I am the one this message was arranged for. That specific thought, the one that says the message applies to people in a more elevated or more certain version of your situation, is the fifth trap form, the legitimacy challenge applied to the message itself rather than to the setup. It is the most elegant version of the mechanism, and identifying it is the final act of setup literacy this message was designed to produce. You are not in the almost cycle because you were not chosen enough. You are coming out of the almost cycle because you received what the cycle was preventing you from receiving, and the exit is not gradual. The setups that change trajectories are specific, and they are here, and the person they were arranged for is ready. If this message landed for you at the depth it was designed to land, leave a comment below. Tell me which of the 5 trap forms you recognized most clearly in your own story. Tell me what you noticed in the 30 seconds of stillness. Tell me if the signal was present. This community grows when chosen ones are specific rather than general about what they receive. Your specificity gives permission to someone else, who is also here to be specific. And specificity is where the trap loses its traction. Share this with someone who is in the middle of the preparation but losing confidence that the preparation is building towards something. They need the vocabulary this message carries, and they need it before the window they are currently inside closes. The conversation that started today continues in the next message and builds on what you have received here. The people who stay in this conversation are the ones who find that the almost cycle becomes less available over time, not because they became more spiritually disciplined, but because the combined effect of what they received in this space changed the neurological and spiritual foundation that the cycle was running on. I will see you in the next message. Come as the person who sees the setup.